Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Eric, for staffing the tech for our meeting today. I'm Karthick Ramakrishnan. I'm a professor of public policy at UC Riverside, founder of Census Legacies and API Data. Really thrilled to have you all joining us today for us to learn, get educated, get motivated, and hopefully get activated on the American Community Survey. I'm joined today by an incredible set of leaders from around the country, and it's not just those who have a speaking role today, but those who are joining us in the audience, if you will. And we want to save plenty of time at the end for us to have a chance to workshop ideas, to get inspired by what's going on. In addition to the states that we're highlighting today, we had a chance recently to meet with some leaders in Texas. So I'm hoping at the end that we'll have a chance to hear about what the plans are in Texas on the American Community Survey and the road to 2030. First, I'd like to introduce Joan Neymark from Max, who's going to be talking a bit more about the case study, but actually let's go to I believe the next slide, Eric, is the overview slide. Yeah, so let me just go a high level agenda here. We're gonna be spending about 10 minutes on the Max case study. Joan's gonna speak for 5 minutes. I'll be presenting our findings from a case study that we just released that you can find on censuslegacies.org/resources. Then we'll hear about Florida. We'll hear from Susan Racher from the Wallace H. Culture Foundation, as well as Tony Carvajal from Florida TaxWatch. Then we'll hear from Jim Tucker, who is the chair of the Census National Advisory Committee and has been coordinating Natives Count for several years now. We'll then hear from Howard Shee at API Data and our strategic plan when it comes to ACS engagement. Then we'll hear from community perspectives in Minnesota, Nevada, and Florida. And then we'll talk about a call to action. Sue Van for the Wallace H. Culture Foundation, as well as Jim Tucker and I will close that formal portion of the agenda. And then we'll invite others who've been leaders in so many ways in trying to get more attention, investment, and support for the American Community Survey. So that's our high-level agenda. Let's go to the next slide, please. So Jo, take it away.
Thank you, Karthick. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Glad to be with you today. Today, as Karthick said, we're going to be talking about the ACS, that very large annual survey from the Census Bureau with rich content for places and cultural communities everywhere. I will share our work in Minnesota over the past decade and ask if you could do something similar in your own state or region. Support for the ACS lays the groundwork for a more accurate 2030 census. The ACS has power. Next slide. Today, we both celebrate and look ahead. Minnesota achieved the highest response rate in the nation by a count of 26 people. Those last get out the count calls and texts were so important. But the 2030 census is 8 years away, and the ACS is right now in every community. There's a relationship between the response rates in the ACS and census, as you can see by maps. I always have to have a map. The pattern holds highest response in the north, and it's consistent over time. So think 2030. Next slide. Why is the ACS important? It provides information for a functioning society. Children, families, elderly, housing and income, highways, hospitals, broadband, workforce, and jobs. Next slide. $1.5 trillion in federal funds flow to states and local areas every year. There are a great number of federal programs that are listed on this slide that are impacted by the ACS. And what most people don't know, it even helps inform planning for the decennial census. Next slide. The ACS is how we tell our stories, and that to me is the most important thing. With detailed information for areas and groups important to us. The data are current and help tell our stories over time. It's the only source of consistent, reliable, and accurate data. Next slide. Karthick asked me to share my own ACS journey. I retired 10 years ago after 30 years of site location market planning at Target Corporation. We use census data every day. I represented the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on the Census Advisory Committee through the year 2011, covering 2 decennial censuses and the launch of the ACS. So I felt responsible. This was like a firstborn child, and the ACS would need advocates. While Congress was talking about defunding or eliminating the ACS at the time, the National Academy of Sciences held a workshop on the benefits, burdens, and prospects of the ACS. This vital resource used by so many was in danger. Next slide. So what did Congress hear about the ACS in 2012? Is this legit? A scam? YouTube had a clear answer. More ACS crap. Invades privacy. Next slide. While misinformation seemed very hard to counter then as now, just 5 calls on the subject can get the attention of elected officials. Finding and sharing 5 positive ACS stories, in fact, was quite easy. I think you would find the same. Next slide. Max was born a year later to educate Congress, that is, those holding the purse strings and oversight, through stories for a stronger ACS to help communities and the economy. We bring multi-sector stakeholders and congressional offices together, sharing the value of and risks to the ACS. Next slide. 10 years later, YouTube had a better view of the ACS. But new ACS risks need to be addressed. Many are listed here. These are frankly more challenging than just public opinion. Next slide. For example, response rates have been declining, starting mid-decade and falling off a cliff in the final years, which provides to us only experimental data for the year 2020. Can we turn this around? You see public opinion and the divisions in society showing up here as well. Next slide. For what can we do to save the ACS? All of us can do these things, learn what it is. The Census Project is a fabulous resource on a national level. Understand how it helps your community tell their story, and join in others supporting the ACS. Respond to the ACS if you are so fortunate to actually be asked to participate, and let others know that it is so important and that they should participate as well. For Max, we are taking some steps to become more sustainable. Our work in Minnesota and with national partners will continue, and we hope to be a resource for other states, maybe even you. Finally, thank you. We can all save the ACS and be ready for the 2030 census together. I hope to see you at the after party and at the end of the presentations today. Our next speaker, Karthick, who you already heard from, engaged in extensive 2020 work in Southern California. He formed the post-census initiative, Census Legacies, which is hosting our event today. Last fall, he asked me if they could conduct a case study on Max from which other states could learn. This important documentation and evaluation by a trusted and independent voice provides a path forward beyond Minnesota. We are very grateful. It tells our story about working together with and for Minnesota communities. Karthick?
Thank you so much, Joan. And folks, you can see why Joan is such an incredible leader, but it takes a village, as you'll see from the case study that we conducted, and really inspiring. And you'll see that there are other states that are already starting to head down this path. So this is an outline of our report, and you can find the report at censuslegacies.org/resources. By the way, Joan is on our advisory board for Census Legacies, as are several others on this call who've been leaders in census and American community survey work for years, if not decades. This is the outline of our report. Let's go to the next slide, please. And part of the motivator is the news headline, right? If you think about Minnesota 2020, think Florida 2000 when it comes to civic engagement, right? It was one of those narrowest of margins. If people say that our votes don't count, people point to Florida as how the narrowest of margins can can make a difference in terms of who's president of the United States? Well, the narrowest of margins, right? Fewer than 30 people made the difference in terms of Minnesota being able to retain its congressional seat. But of course, it's not just about congressional apportionment. Census matters for so much more. I think a lot of communities woke up to why the census is so important in terms of counting for dollars, but most people may not recognize that the American Community Survey is just as important, or in some ways even more important, because the American Community Survey is the source of data for so much market intelligence, consumer intelligence, and just intelligence about our localities that matters for planning, that matters for firm decisions, that matters for the work of nonprofits. Next slide. So in terms of the methods we used, our main method was in-depth interviews. We also reviewed prior published reports and other archival materials going back for over a decade. We also analyzed old interviews from the Max Voices campaign and online content from essential Max partners like the Minnesota State Demographic Center, the Minnesota Council on Foundations, and the Census Project. We also reviewed news coverage and other materials that can help us gain insight into the impact that Max had on census and ACS efforts. Next slide. So in terms of the guiding questions, we asked, what are the origins of Max and how did the organization come together? What are key features of the Max model? What kind of strategies were implemented? What were the key accomplishments? And then what lessons can other states learn? Importantly, as in any case study, there are many insights you can gain, but your mileage will vary, right? So any state that's thinking of doing this will have to think about customizing and adapting that model to suit its needs, both in terms of, if you want to think about a SWOT analysis, opportunities and threats, but also strengths and weaknesses, not only of an organization, but of a collective of organizations. Next slide. So in terms of the origins and development of Max, by the way, we were just thrilled to be part of helping Max develop its new logo, which you'll see. And as you can see in their logo, they're already thinking ahead to the 2030 census. And we know that a few other states are already on their way in terms of the roadmap to 2030. What we would like to emphasize in this call and the work that Census Legacies does is to have as much attention paid to the American Community Survey as possible. As many of you may know, the 2020 ACS 1 year, the standard files were not released because of challenges related to COVID. But as Joan has been pointing out, even before COVID, we were seeing this decline in response rates, and especially in rural areas and many other parts of the country. Next slide. As you can see in the report, the Census Project plays a critical role in terms of the kinds of resources and partnerships that Max benefited from. And I would encourage everyone to check out the Census Project in terms of their most recent report and call to action when it comes to advocacy around the ACS. This will be an important resource for future state efforts to get people engaged on the American Community Survey and aware of the American Community Survey. Next slide. And there's a lot here to summarize, and I only have a couple of minutes, but there are several achievements. So it wasn't just about Census 2020 and congressional apportionment. Gaining recognition, awareness, and support for the Minnesota congressional delegation was huge. Let's go to the next slide. Right, and Joan had presented some of these pictures before, but pictures do tell 1,000 words, right? In terms of having community organizations not only aware, motivated, and educated, but to get them empowered to be able to advocate on behalf of their own communities and to have that sophistication of what we at API Data call, and the Center for Social Innovation call, data, narrative, and action. Next slide. And it leads to validator quotes like these from a government official and there were several who marveled and recognized how important this work was in terms of relationship building, in terms of capacity building, in terms of keeping momentum going, and that sophistication. So it wasn't just about those standard talking points about the census. It is that knowledge and awareness about the American Community Survey and how it lands not only the state of Minnesota, but in particular congressional districts. Next slide. Some strategies that we're seeing, the one before this. Some strategies essential to success. It was bipartisan and multi-sector, clear and concise messaging, broad array of partners. Next slide. Now you'll be hearing from Susan Brower, who's the state demographer in Minnesota later on today. Mac's voices played an important role in that kind of narrative building in addition to the kind of data points. Next slide. So in terms of strategies that are key to success, you can read our report for more information. And let's just go to the end, to the state of Florida, and I'll introduce Susan Racher from the Wallace H. Coulter Foundation. And Susan will talk a bit more about what they accomplished in Florida, the lessons learned, the things they wish they had, and how Florida is organizing to make it different for the coming years heading into 2030. Susan.
Greetings from Florida, the place of sun, fun, and the wonderful salsa music that Karthick played at the beginning. Also, that's one of the top 3 states in omissions in many of the censuses. What you see on this first slide is the comparison above between 2020 and 2010. Green is good, red is not. Neither is beige, but we did move ahead in 2020 for the first time in 30 years. What Joan mentioned is that the ACS is very much aligned to the census outcomes and has really mobilized us to leverage what worked and to correct what did not work in 2020. Next slide. So I'm a finance person, I think in terms of assets and liabilities. And included in our assets was just an incredible steering committee that came together, led by Florida Philanthropic Network, that came together in June of 2019 when our governor announced that he was not going to support the census. And we had national support, great information flow. We leveraged the texting and the media, the digital that came from the best practices nationally. We had an incredible group of 67 or 68 nonprofits working in their communities, and the first time that we brought local funds together. However, let's focus on what needs to be corrected. The list of those who didn't care about the census is fairly long. State of Florida, the associations, lobbyists, chambers, companies, business leadership, and many funders. And we spoke to virtually all of them to try to engage. And the result of that was county and local fragmentation and state fragmentation. And so we put our thinking caps on. How are we going to do better going forward? We did okay in 2020, we were ahead, but how are we going to do better? Next slide. So we have put together a strategy that addresses the 2 areas that really will help us leverage the work we did and carry it forward from 2020 through the ACS and the 2030 census. We're working with our fabulous partner, Florida Philanthropic Network, to message to the funders and tee them up and get them engaged much earlier and coordinate across sectors. And we're working with Florida TaxWatch, which is the 501c3 nonpartisan tax watchdog group that is highly, highly influential in the business community, the association community, and with elected officials. And Florida TaxWatch did a lot of evangelical work for the 2020 census, and we became friends. We are hoping, and you'll hear from Tony Carvajal, to engage these constituencies and create a cross communication of information, data, messaging, and policy. Next slide. And why are we doing this? Joan talked about aggregated, disaggregated data, dollars, and distribution. For us at Coulter, we're sunsetting in 2025. It's almost as if you're planning, your retirement or your mortality. We want to leave the communities, the AAPI community, the AIAN community, and the states like Florida that we worked with directly in a better place going forward and with a sustainable infrastructure. And we want the work we did in 2020, the work we're going to be doing with Florida Philanthropic Network and TaxWatch to be a catalyst for that sustainable infrastructure. And I am absolutely delighted to introduce our partner, Tony Carvajal with Florida TaxWatch. Tony brings a unique combination of business, nonprofit, chamber, and association expertise and experience to the table. So Tony, you can take it away.
Susan, thank you so much for that backdrop. I wish it was positive news, but as you well reported there, the missing piece in the census process this last time was the business community. And it's not necessarily that they're complacent as a rule. It's just that they weren't spoken to and engaged in all the right ways. We did our traditional marketing. We told the stories about the dollars lost, but just like we would with any other audience, we have to speak in their language if we want them to understand. One of the reasons this is so important is because, at least here in Florida, but I think it's a trend across the country, the business community has a disproportionate impact on a number of audiences, employees, customers, but especially political actors, our governor, the legislature, and the network of trade and professional associations that amplify this. So thanks for the support from Wallace Coulter Foundation, not just the fiscal support, but really the kick in the pants. We're going to be moving forward on some strategies here. If you'll go to the next slide, I'll start where Joan mentioned. 2030 is a really long way away. So while we care about the 2030 census, if you'll pull the slides back up, if you care about the 2030 census, you really can start now to energize and mobilize the audience, and the ACS is the tool for that. And why is this so critical? Because there's a real opportunity here. Selling the census this far out is difficult, but selling critical business decision information is not. The demographic, household, economic, and social characteristic information that the ACS produces is absolutely essential. And if you start telling people right now that all the data that they are relying on for their business strategy is at risk, and start explaining that, the third-party sources that they turn to are also building on this, you start recognizing that there's an opportunity now. And for those of us in the business community that have done grassroots work, you just never want to waste a good crisis, and we have an opportunity here to tell the story. Our immediate strategy builds around, what I'll call the 3 R's: reporting, resources, and a roadshow. We're going to engage people across the state, as well as a media strategy. And I want to highlight, this election cycle provides us an opportunity, not for partisan or political messaging, but an opportunity to discuss what's missing. If you'll go to the next slide, I'm just going to lay out a thumbnail of what the strategy is here. We're looking at a longer engagement and activation plan, and you'll see that this really does go through a traditional campaign strategy, at least the way that the business community engages in political and grassroots mobilization. It involves targets in our media markets. Florida benefits from 7 major media markets, and we'll have strategies in each of those. We'll also work with partners, but especially local and regional organizations such as chambers and economic development organizations and workforce boards that have a unique opportunity to speak to these folks. And we'll also have what I'll call a precinct strategy that will coordinate the business message. Susan mentioned something that was very important. I don't want to lose this, though. We are staying connected to the funder and the advocate community. So this is an all-in-one approach, something that has been missing, but Joan mentioned in her presentation about Minnesota how important it was. It's absolutely going to be important as we go forward. Let's go to the next page, because I'll be happy to talk about the strategy with anybody who'd like. On the last slide, I'll put up my contact information. But I want to highlight a few items that may be kind of missed if you're not used to the organizing the business model. Look, the message can't be a unidimensional conversation about equity. It is not that the people at companies do not care about equities, they absolutely do, but that's just not the language of business. So we are using conduits such as chambers as our key infrastructure for communicating messages. And the nice thing about that is we're not going to build that structure, it already exists, and they need information. So we're actually providing the institutional actors things that they want. Second item is that this will give us an opportunity to seed the grassroots, and the grass tops will provide resources and a portal and information. But what is often overlooked as we do business mobilization, at least from an advocacy effort, is that C-suite conversation, what I'll call brass tops. This is a tight network. It's embedded in all the key institutions across the state. They help make political contributions and decisions, and that's one of the reasons they're so connected to so many of the political actors. We engage them in a completely different way, and they engage each other with business to business and business to government, B2B and B2G conversations. We'll have a leadership council that is made up of these, and these are our strike force. We'll use the traditional grassroots and grass tops models to communicate the strategy, but we need that high level brass tops to take things in a completely different direction. If this is the type of conversation you want to find out more about, if you'll go to the next slide, you can reach out to us. We're going to be sharing our model here in Florida with our partners here in the state. I do want to highlight that there are other organizations similar to TaxWatch. There's an organization called the Government Research Association, Government Research Association. There's about 28 other state organizations like us and other local organizations that we're having a conversation with them as well about activating. If you want to help us here in Florida, or if we can help you outside of the state, I really want to extend the invitation to reach out to us. You'll see another name here on the screen, Meg Cannon. She's on our team as well. Her name is easier to spell if you can't spell Carvajal, but I look forward to engaging with you, and I'll be on the after party as well, because this is so darn exciting to us. I love the opportunities that come from Census 2030, but the ACS strategy is what we have to focus right now, and the business gets it. Shortly, you'll also hear from a good colleague of mine, Dr. Jerry Parrish, will reinforce some information from when we worked together on the Florida scorecard at the Florida Chamber. So Karthick, I think I'll throw it back to you. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and look forward to making a difference in this process.
Thank you, Tony. Well, we actually have Howard Shee from API Data. We're just going to go boom, boom, boom. A lot of information coming your way. So Howard.
Sure. Was Jim Tucker going to go first?
Oh,
or?
right. Oh, my apologies.
Yeah.
That's right. We have Jim Tucker
just want to
from
make
Native
sure.
Account. Okay, that's right.
So I'll actually try to go through this fairly quickly. Next slide, please. The starting point is I just want to highlight the national culture partners, the Native American Rights Fund, the National Congress of American Indians, the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, and the as well as the Alaska Federation of Natives. We're all out to try to achieve what you see in the slide, 100% count. Next slide, please. The starting point has to be where, oh, it's actually obscured for some reason. My highlight obscured it. If you could actually see what's behind that, you would see that in 2010, on reservations, natives had an undercount of 4.88%. In 2020, it was about 5.6%. And we're out to change that. That's our starting point, because we have to look at that largely because a lot of the same factors that impact the decennial impact the ACS. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to highlight a few of these quickly. The first is language. This shows you the areas where we provided language coverage during the decennial, and we're going to try to do the same thing for ACS. Next slide, please. I'm going to have the slide up twice, and it's just so you can see where the tribes are located. And the first slide is actually going to show where the broadband, lack of broadband is. So next slide. And if you will focus on the Northern Plains states, Montana, North and South Dakota, and the Southwestern states around the Four Corners area, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And then the next slide, please. Alaska is particularly bad. You can see all of the yellow here is bad. That means that there is lack of broadband affordability and connectivity. So that's another challenge that we face. Next slide, please. And again, just to remind you where the reservations are, we're going to go to the next slide so I can show you the update leave areas during the decennial census. The reason why I'm showing you this is because these are areas that have non-traditional mailing addresses, which means they do not get mail from the Census Bureau. That makes it a challenge whether we're doing decennial, the ACS, or any other annual or periodic census survey. Next slide, please. So there's some good news in this. The Census Bureau last October opened up the Office of Strategic Alliances. It's evergreening the Tribal Partnership Specialist Program from the decennial census. We're really excited that we're working with them. Next slide, please. And equally excited that we are the guinea pigs. We have 4 evergreen tribal relations specialists. This is a translation from the Tribal Partnership Specialist during the decennial census. We will have 4. You can see that there is a 4th TBA. We're hoping we will get that person soon. But again, we're hoping that this is also something, a program that could be implemented for other historically undercounted populations. Next slide, please. So this is how we're going to be addressing, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. We're really trying to address the underlying reasons why the American Indian Alaska Native population is historically undercounted. They're intractable problems that we're seeing every single census survey. We are working on subgroups focusing on messaging, trying to improve the messaging to those communities, outreach, as well as just overcoming some of the general barriers to participation, such as the ones I showed, such as language and broadband and addressing. Next slide, please. As we close it out, I just want to remind you that the census and the ACS is one of the 4 culture convener pillars. And with that, I am at the end of my presentation quite quickly, and I'm going to turn it back over to Karthick.
Thank you, Jim. And if, Sue will say this later, but I believe now ACS has now become one of the 2 pillars, at least in API country, if you will. But I'll turn it over to Howard Sheet, who is the managing director of API Data, to talk about API Data's ACS engagement strategy.
Thanks, Karthik. Just waiting for the slides to come up. Yeah, so we can just go right to the next slide. So our ACS initiative work is really framed around the data equity work that we do. It's really important to share this framework just for context. You know, we believe that it's really important to incorporate community expertise and research expertise based in the community to all stages and aspects of data and research to ensure that that data equity is achieved. And you know, the whole process goes from the design and implementation of a survey or research project through the collection of data and the compilation all the way to analysis and how the data is shared with the community and how it's made accessible. I do want to highlight or mention a report on data equity at the federal agency level that we are working on and plan to release on May 24th in partnership with the National Council of Asia Pacific Americans in the White House and the White House Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Initiative, as well as with community partners. We hope to use this to make sure that we hold federal agencies accountable to making sure that the Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are captured in any data efforts that they make. Next slide. So with that framework in mind, the main goals that we have for the ACS data outreach initiative is around three major goals. One is to educate, to just make our communities and stakeholders aware of what the census is, how valuable it is, and what's the power of the ACS is. The second is to motivate, is to really get them to go beyond awareness, but really just use the data, be engaged with the data, use the data in their daily activities, and learn how to leverage the data for the work that they do on the ground. And then finally, activate. We really want to organize our community to really push for additional resources to help improve language access in all aspects of the data and research collection, and also make sure that the community is included in all aspects of the process, and to ensure that the data that comes out is disaggregated and useful for our communities. Next slide. So to sort of step through the major areas of the data and research stages, the first one is design and development. We want to make sure that our community is engaged with the Census Bureau as the Census Bureau yet again revisits how our communities are captured through the race and ethnic questions. There's a redesign effort and going on, and we want to make sure that any changes that are made do not negatively impact our ability to see ourselves in the data. We also want to ensure that planning for the 2030 census and ongoing program design for the American Community Survey includes a language support for all the different languages that are spoken in the AIAN and AAPI community, as well as the community partnership program that I think Jim mentioned, making sure that we stay engaged as a community with the Census Bureau on all important questions of the design and development process. Next slide. In the collection, compilation, processing phase, we recently pulled together a lot of advocacy to make sure that disaggregated data for from the 2020 census is both released in a timely fashion and at levels that are useful and vital for our communities. We are also working to build community partnerships with the Census Bureau just to increase awareness about the American Community Survey in the field, helping the Census Bureau just build awareness during the data collection process for to the Asian American community. And then finally, better communicate the impact of the differential privacy and the impact on data availability for small communities. Next slide. And then finally, when the data comes out, what are we going to do? We want to make sure that we have community convenings to build awareness around how data is used, great examples of data narrative examples from community groups, sharing data gems to show where to get data and how to present it, making sure that the Census Bureau engages with our community to make sure that the tools that they create are useful and usable to our community, and then training opportunities to build actual data capacity among community-based organizations to leverage the data. I also want to mention that we at AAPI Data are creating tools to help make data more accessible. If you hit to the next slide, so that we have a main website, AAPIdata.com. It has a lot of great tools and products on there. Next slide, one of which is the censusmaps.aapidata.com. We will be updating this as soon as we can get 2020 census data, and we'll probably look at on the next slide is a new tool that's currently in beta mode that will present demographic data from the American Community Survey and make it easy for people to access race and ethnicity and in Asian group data for a lot of what's in the ACS, and we're concentrating on the state level and some information also at the county level. And once we have, for people who are interested, please reach out to us at AAPI Data, and we can put you on a list to help us beta test this tool. And with that, we'll go back to Karthick.
Great, thank you, Howard. Yeah, I should say it's both Asian American as well as Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities in terms of the detailed information whenever possible that we'll have on our site. Okay, so let's stop the screen share and let's go to our community perspective. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by folks from around the country. Susan Brower from the state of Minnesota, Vita Lynn from the state of Nevada, and Jerry Parrish, Dr. Jerry Parrish from the state of Florida. So first I'll ask Susan to do just a quick self-intro about the State Demographer's Office. And the question I have teeing up is, Susan, please tell us more about how and why the State Demographer's Office got involved in the 2020 census.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So in Minnesota, the State Demographer's Office, which is part of state government, it had been the central hub of outreach in past censuses. So it was an expectation that we would be involved in some way. But in 2020 in Minnesota, or before 2020 in Minnesota, Other organizations outside of government stepped up early, philanthropic organizations, nonprofit organizations, and as part of their interest in civic engagement, they wanted to lead these efforts alongside of us. And I said, great, the more the merrier, let's do it. So that's how we got involved. We knew we were going to be involved, but we were pulled into this larger effort encompassing kind of more outside of state government than I think had been done in the past. So we started organizing with these groups 5 years in advance of the census. The group collectively was called the Minnesota Census Mobilization Partnership, or MCMP. And at the urging of MCMP, our office was funded by the state legislature to do additional census engagement, grant making for community groups, and also some communications, shared kind of staffing types of activities. We were very much focused on governments, local governments in our efforts. So we trained a couple of years in advance of the census. We trained counties and cities and townships to set up their own complete count committees. This was well before the Census Bureau had the staff in place to do that or the training materials. We just knew that we needed to do that early and get people moving. And then kind of in contrast to the work we were doing with local governments, the foundations, the nonprofit part of MCMP focused specifically on historically undercounted communities and made an engagement plan focusing specifically on those groups. And then finally, Max, you heard from Joan, focused on the federal delegation, the congressional delegation. And so that was kind of the structure and how we fit into it here in Minnesota.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. Next, I'm going to go to Vita Lin from ACDC Nevada. It's an organization that many of you may not be familiar with, so I want to provide the opportunity for Vita to say a bit more about ACDC and the importance of data in terms of your growth and programming, and then what you achieved with respect to the Census 2020 effort.
Sure. The Asian Community Development Council, as we know, ACDC, is the only Asian organization in Nevada that has staff to serve the API community. When we started in 2015, our budget was at $32,000. 5 years later, our budget is $3 million, and we're growing. We'll continue to grow. So the foundations, the corporation, the government grants, and individual donors that reaches out to us because they want to give us more funding. And that's because the only organization that has API data is ACDC. And we use those data constantly. ACDC, the Nevada has over 30 different Asian groups. We have over 100 language and over 1,000 dialects. And in the 2020 census, the Nevada shows that we have 386,012 Asian and Asian Pacific Islander. The Filipinos is at 45%, over 180,000. The Chinese is next, which is at 15%, almost 60,000. And then we have the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander at 11%. We're known as the 9th island because of all the people moving to Nevada. And then we have the Japanese, the Indian, the Korean, Vietnamese, and so forth. So these are the data that we use to reach out to do advocacy work for our community and to reach out to elected officials to make sure that they make sure that we are counted. The API community needs these data more than any other groups because it's diverse ethnic groups. It's funny, when I first met with some of the funders, they always seem to be surprised because the API community needs help. They're the model minority. And we don't think that they need any support until I show them the ACS data. With that data, I get to educate them. So that's what we've been doing in Nevada.
Vita, thank you so much. By the way, folks, I love the crispness of all of these remarks. You're hitting these points so efficiently and powerfully. I'd like to next invite Jerry, Dr. Jerry Parrish from Florida State University, and also affiliated previously with the Chamber and various efforts there. Jerry, let's start pivoting to take a look at the American Community Survey. We've talked about the census, but Vita has already gotten us in the groove of talking about ACS and why it's so vital. Can you say about what you and colleagues like Tony and others intend to do to make sure that there's greater awareness about why ACS is so essential to business?
Thanks, Karthik, and welcome everyone. One of the things that both Tony Carvajal and I did was really take ACS data and translate it so the business community could understand it and know where it came from. Between he and I bet we talked to easily tens of thousands of business people around the state of Florida in rebuilding the Florida scorecard. You may want to take a look at that. It's graphically available where people can use it. It's at thefloridascorecard.org. I helped redesign that thing while I was working with Tony over there. And what really became the main thing was businesses are absolutely depend on data that is correct. They understand that. And there was almost an insatiable demand. We started making maps and doing data and maps at zip code levels about things like kids in poverty and things like that. The business leaders didn't understand until we started talking about that stuff. And so what we did in every presentation was to credit the ACS data for where it came from. That created speaking demands on both Tony and me. I remember Tony one year was out on the road about 200 nights a year. I was probably out on the road 100 nights that same year. And really the majority of what we were talking about was already in the ACS, and business people absolutely learned that. And now they understand why it's so important. And they all the leading businesses I know use that type of data when they do their planning.
Thanks, Jerry. I'm going to ask you about the 1 year miss, if you will, on the 2020 ACS. We know that the 5-year ACS has a larger sample size, so you can go down to lower geographic levels. But if you wanted the most current data, you need that 1 year ACS. What kind of awareness was there, that we're dealing with First of all, there's a delay. It was experimental tables, and you couldn't get it below the state level.
Right. And to be blunt, it was pretty disappointing to a lot of our businesses, that depend on that December delivery and where we can update a consistent series, all the way down to very, zip code level and those kind of levels. So they understood why that happened. They're concerned about the fidelity of the data, of course, as we move forward. And they understand what's going on. They don't blame anybody, I believe, but certainly they're looking forward to things going back to normal. And I believe this is our opportunity to teach the business people that we speak to, both Tony and I, his organization and mine, out there on the road, telling them really what happened, what they can expect, that we'll be back to normal this year, and we'll go back to a more common unit of measure, if you will, as far as something that they can depend on to do their planning with.
Well, I think part of it's going to involve advocacy, and I see Mary Jo from the Census Project in the thing. So when we go to the after party, folks, I think we're going to have like a really good, impactful conversation if Mary Jo and others are able to stay. Now, let me just go to Susan and to Vita again, and then we will go to our call to action. So Susan, how does your office see the important work ahead of strengthening the ACS and demographic data for decision-making in Minnesota moving forward?
So there are a lot of changes potentially coming to the ACS, and our role historically has been to be data experts more so than engagement experts, although we've taken some of that on too. But where we are unique is that we see how the data are being used. We have a connection with the experts at the Census Bureau, so we know kind of what's in the pipeline, what we may expect out of the ACS in coming years. And so we can help people be prepared for that and organize around some of the issues that may arise in the future. So I'd say definitely kind of being a source of knowledge to folks who use the data is one of our primary roles. I'd also say we have kind of a ready network of stakeholders, because part of our full-time job is to help people find the data that they need. So we already have these connections with folks who are looking to answer questions that they care about. So in those kind of two roles, both as data experts and then also as a kind of a hub of stakeholders, those are kind of the roles that we play.
Thank you, Susan. And in the prep call, we talked about census legacies and potentially seeing if we can build a kind of community of practice and a stronger network with state demographers' office and population research centers across the country. It won't be the same kind of after party that we'll have today, but at the very least, if we can get together in person,
That'll be more fun.
Yeah, exactly. The state demographers, the secret is they're the biggest
right.
partiers. Yeah. Again, finally to Vida. Vida, you've already talked about the American Community Survey and how important it is. What are your plans and Howard kind of laid out what API data is going to do to support partners from around the country. What are you already thinking about your work plan in the coming year and ACS and ACS awareness and engagement?
Sure. And for us to talk about that, we had to talk about 2020. It's a big year. It was the census, it was the election. And we had over 30 canvassers ready to go out to the community to do that, right? To talk about the census. But in March of 2020, everything shut down. The casino shut down, and many of our API community works in the casino, or they own small businesses, or they work in hospital and healthcare. And we had to retrain our staff to say, how are we going to pivot from doing face-to-face to get the message out? So we had to do social media. We had to hit like Facebook, TikTok, or go to the Asian WeChat to reach out to them. But we had to think outside the box and retrain them to figure out how to do and how important is the census, right? So we did evenings like we dropped stuff in the bags with information in the door, ring the doorbell, drop information to them and kind of get the message out. And also wanted to make sure that our community know that, don't worry, I know we're going through a pandemic, but let's stay calm and come together, right? In the meantime, the governor reaches out to us and say, hey, we want you to translate in different languages what is essential worker, what is not. Then the health department reached out to us to do the same, to talk about information about COVID. Then the school district reached out to us and say, you help us translate what is virtual learning for the students and how do we get the Chromebooks out to them. We were the go-to organization because we can translate in different languages for our community. And then we had the whole anti-Asian hate crime going on, right? So we have a lot of Chinese, Filipino, Vietnamese nurses and doctors that's in the healthcare. And they were faced with a lot of discrimination, say, you're the one who brought us the virus, in this kind of a hate environment, right? So what we did, the ACDC and all the Asian groups coming together, the Chinese, the Filipino, the Korean and Thai, we all came together, worked together to get 40,000 disposable masks to the hospital when they couldn't get the disposable masks. We got cleaning supplies and hand sanitizers. And we
Vida, just in the interest of time, 30 seconds to close, please.
Okay, sorry. So just to let you know, because of all the service that we did, and because the government reached out to us and we're the go-to person, we were asked to do the food pantry, the CARES Act, and apply for food to help our community. We were supposed to help 150 families. We end up helping 1,500 families. And to this day, we reach out and feeding 14,000 API. And to tell you how we're gonna push the data, we have a strong database. We have a strong network right now. We know how to reach out to our community, and we're gonna tell them the importance of filling out the ACS. Without data, we cannot continue to give those services. And to get the message out, data, especially for our community, is important. And I can tell you, to sum everything up, during this whole pandemic, it was great to see all the Asians coming together to support and help our community, but not to forget our partner with the Silver State Voices and that group and that team coming together, making sure all our community is taken care of. So that's how we're going to push out the ACS, and it's a data-driven, is so important. This is how we get funding.
Thank you, Vita. And I would say, even though the folks you engage with might look very different from the folks that Jerry is engaging with, still the same message, right? To be able to translate how data relates to everyday bread and butter or bottom line concerns, whether it's individuals or communities or businesses. So thank you all for this wonderful conversation. I'm going to now turn it over to Sue Van, who will say a bit about why the Wallace Age Culture Foundation is making ACS such a major part of their forward-looking strategy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Karthick. Susan said a little bit. Vita probably said the rest. For those of you who do not know, Culture Foundation will sunset first quarter of 2025. We had no strategies when we started the 2010 census. It was out of the blue. We heard that there was a need in the API community. They weren't getting funded. So our first investment into the AANHPI community was the 2010 census. In going around the country debriefing, Susie and I learned about the AAPI community. To be very candid, you have heard me say before, we did not grow up with a community. I didn't know about a community. I didn't know the components of the community. And I certainly didn't know that there were 50 different ethnicities and over 100 different languages and dialects. Because of the debrief and listening and hearing and getting informed and educated about the needs of that community, the differences and the opportunities and challenges, was how and why Culture launched the AAPI program, which at this time now we have probably invested over $175 million since the census 2010. If you think that the disaggregated data is important, do you know the power of disaggregated data? Culture did the first ever demographic profile for the Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders consolidated not only in the state of Hawaii and the mainland because of the importance of disaggregated data. I had no idea what disaggregated data did or was used or was translated or interpreted until I read that report. And I would ask everybody to read that report, 2014, from the Advancing Justice LA. That report taught me in one booklet the importance of disaggregated data, the fairness of disaggregated data, the importance of the accuracy, and the importance of the power. If it were not for that report, Culture would not be the biggest funder for the Pacific Islanders in this country and the Asian Americans in this country. And one more thing, when Jim spoke, we got approached to be asked to fund language needs in the Native American community. It never occurred to me, but I suppose, yes, just like people don't really understand that the Native American community is urban and tribal, it didn't occur to me that there would be a language issue in AIAN populations. We funded that because we understand the issue of the challenge of languages coming from 100 different dialects. So therefore we funded Indian country. Because of the need for the languages, we also then understood the dire need for funding for the census. So we funded Indian country on a conglomerated basis. I asked who and what is the dream team for Census 2020 for Indian country. And we had around that table representatives of clinics, of institutes, urban Indians, tribal Indians, the legal groups, everybody we could think of. And we funded Indian country as a whole. So why is the ACS important to me? It's personal, ladies and gentlemen. If it weren't for the census, Culture would have never had an AANHPI program. If it weren't for the ACS, we would not be the ones understanding the absolute need for ACS because it is the biggest, most important, and the broadest source of disaggregated data in the country. And although many populations are not monoliths, I don't think anybody can deny that in the Asian American and AAPI community, we have 50 different ethnicities. like Rita said, over 100 different dialects and languages. Although that diversity is wonderful and enriching to our lives, it is really challenging when it comes to data and research and education. So these two communities, the Native American community has a real need for language translation in reference to their voting or ballots or other rules and regulations. And you can see the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community. Each of those communities could not succeed without disaggregated data. And for sure, without timely and accurate disaggregated data, they will most certainly not be getting their fair share of resources, opportunities, and access. So the ACS is really personal to me. And I think that if we could work together, these two communities with the Coulter Foundation for the next 3 years, then hopefully the ACS will be the yellow brick road to the 2030 census, which we hope will be a walk in the park for these two communities, having worked with Coulter all these years.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. I'm going to ask Jim to just say a few words. You talked about Indian country. Jim also works and supports on voting rights. And many people might not realize why the ACS is so vital when it comes to voting rights in this country. Jim, I know that you're about to head out and you're at the airport. I don't know if you can say a few words before we jump.
Sure. Thanks so much, Karthick. I guess the closing thoughts that I would have are that the 2020 census showed us what worked and what didn't. What worked really was the strength of the partnerships, the Coulter Coalition, what they were able to do for the AAPI community and the American Indian Alaska Native community. We obviously saw that even where we had an undercount in Indian country, that undercount would have been considerably higher had we not had the investment and the resources and the partnerships that we did. But seeing that things worked well, and one of the most important things that did work well was the relationships and trusted messengers the Census Bureau built up through the Tribal Partnership Specialist Program. We are really encouraging and working with the Census Bureau to evergreen that and apply it to other groups. The other thing I would just mention is that the ACS has always been kind of the unwanted stepchild in some respects of the Census Bureau, just in terms of resources. And we think that it is under-resourced. We would like to see more resources directed towards the American Community Survey, just to make it a much more effective program. But we're looking forward to working with the Census Bureau. Karthick didn't say it about himself, but I will give a shout out to him that he is also on the National Advisory Committee. And we're certainly looking forward to working with the Census Bureau to improve that as we move forward towards the ACS and the other annual and periodic surveys before we get to 2030. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jim. And I'll say that just a couple of final words from Census Legacies and API data. And I would just say me personally on the NAC as well. This notion of making the Census Bureau more user-friendly and community-friendly, right? We love turns of phrases, and we just need to make sure, just like maybe some of you know, in the higher ed space, people said, how do we make people college ready? More and more colleges are saying, how do we make ourselves student ready? Right, to shift that focus. We're really inspired by the possibilities of that Office of Strategic Alliances, but to really make it as community-centered as possible, because this is our government. These are agencies and tools that are meant to serve us. So how can we do that work better and stronger? Final thing I'll say, and I have this kind of little spark of an idea. API Vote has this t-shirt that says, ask me why I vote. I would love for us to think about a kind of t-shirt, and maybe this is something we can design with all of you, saying, ask me about the ACS, and for people to wear that. But what that means is if you're the wearer of that shirt, you better know what the ACS is. So if someone stops you in a grocery store and says, what is the ACS? That you're able to do that 30-second pitch, 1-minute pitch, and maybe if they're really interested, you can like somehow relate it to that, to the kind of foods that are available in that grocery store, and have a 5-minute conversation about why it's so essential to the community. But we're now moving into this more interactive period. People should be able to unmute themselves. But first I see Angela Broyles from Texas Census 2030, which is, I believe, a brand new effort. I don't know if it's been formally constituted yet, but Angela, can you say a bit more about what you and others are planning to do in Texas and maybe even reactions from what you're hearing, in Florida and from the Minnesota example.
Yeah, thank you, Karthik. This has been extremely helpful. As he mentioned, I'm Angela Broyles from the Texas Census 2030, and we are, in fact, a brand new organization. We're continuing the work from 2020. A lot of my partners and I worked on the 2020 campaign under the partnership of a couple different foundations and nonprofits, but now we have splintered off to produce an entirely different organization that will be supporting similar work, but more in a continuous fashion. So at this stage in our work, we're still in the development stage. We're developing our strategic plan and kind of figuring out what our next steps are. But I have to say, listening to everyone speak, Tony, you basically, everything you said about Florida is almost mirrored for Texas. So, and what we've realized over these last 6 months is that, we have the foundations, a lot of the foundational support. We have a lot of the activist support, but what we don't have is we don't have leadership support. We don't have a lot of business support. And so what we're needing to do is develop a plan to engage more of, not to steal words from you, but the grass tops. We need the leadership and the business community to really get on board with this as we continue the campaign, and then also maintain those relationships with the foundations and the nonprofits. So we are, like I said, at the strategic planning phase, if you go to, you can see what Texas did at texascensus.org. A lot of the same organizations will be working with us on our campaign. But as we develop our new division, we'll definitely pull on some of the things that we've learned from this call. Back to you, Tony. I'm 100% probably going to get an email from me when this ends, because I really feel the business community is a big part of Texas. We've already been, the North Texas Chamber of Commerce was on the census work, but we want to engage them more. And I know that it'll be great to have some thought partnership from other people in different states that are, already embarking on this work to help us pave a successful path. So.
Thank you, Angela. Others on the call, I think, especially, what we saw not only in states like Texas and Florida, but so many states across the country, that it was a real struggle for states to, invest in census outreach. Mm-hmm. Some states there was outright hostility, if not benign or hostile neglect of this effort. And really, I think people, unfortunately, it got politicized in ways that just were so counterproductive if we understand how essential ACS is to the functioning of so many systems. Mm-hmm. And the census, of course, right? And it's the kind of fair share of dollars, fair share of representation, and having the kind of more accurate intelligence about our communities. So I don't know if others, especially speakers who have spoken already, but even others, Joan, I'm just curious, Max has become a bit of a celebrity, but at the same time, there is only one organization right now that is at a state level talking about ACS. So what are you hoping? I know that, so by the way, Mary Jo Huxma from Census Project said she had to leave, but she is happy to be in touch. And maybe, Joan, you can say a little bit about how useful and helpful the Census Project was in your kind of early stage of development, and hopefully that can serve as a bit of a roadmap. And then I'll turn it over to Jeff Weiss. But Joan, let's hear about your kind of partnership and relationship with Census Project and how useful that has been in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karthik, for that question. Both Terry Ann Lowenthal and Mary Jo Hoeksema have been strong partners for me during, Terry Ann has moved on from Census Project now, but frankly, they do the work that lets us know at the local level, what are the messages, what are the funding requests, and the timing to do that. So the citizenship question, they have stakeholder sign-on letters with 1,000 different, national and local groups who do this work. So I really recommend that you sign up at least for their newsletter. And I think you'll get suggestions and ideas. They're also a great source of census and ACS media coverage, just if you want to find a go-to source. That's a great one. I'm delighted by what I've heard here today. And you're right, I don't hear anyone, and perhaps Texas will be like Minnesota has, where it's multi-sector, but I'm mostly hearing groups focused on their own community. And I think somehow bridging that gap between the different sectors would be very powerful. I know each individual sector and community is powerful in its own right, but I do think there's power in numbers, if you will. And so that's why I'm particularly interested in, you know, connecting even with Florida. We have a strong business voice here in Minnesota that I didn't really highlight, but I think everything Florida TaxWatch is doing is exactly what I've learned so far, what works, what doesn't. Don't spend your time on things that aren't going to be as helpful. So thank you
Great.
for that. And I'd love to connect with anyone. I think you have my contact info. The slides will come out. It has it there. So thanks.
Thank you, Joan. And then I would say, and we'll go to Jeff and Angela in a second, but if this didn't come through clearly, Florida TaxWatch, you know, that's a kind of demonstration project. And with the family of tax watches in other states, you know, hopefully that's something that can spread as well. These kind of tools, right? One of the fundamental insights of Census 2020 was trusted messengers, right? But you got to educate, motivate, and then activate all of those trusted messengers. And I think, you know, Howard had that in his slide. That's going to be the work ahead. Jeff, if you could introduce yourself, would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. I'm Jeff Weiss. I'm with the New York Census and Redistricting Institute at New York Law School. New York is still smarting over losing a congressional district to Minnesota over the size of one packed subway car of 89 people. But I must say that early on, we learned a lot of lessons from the Minnesota ACS group and the early work that you did. So we just didn't catch it up far enough and fast enough. But not to let that happen again, just to let you all know, in New York, those of us that were active in Census 2020, we actually had a meeting yesterday of funders, of a few of the activists and numbers people to rebuild and plan for not only just 2030, but ACS and things that were, you know, that I've heard discussed in the last hour in this call. So we're all on the same page. New York State government did not invest a great amount of effort or money in the last census, despite whatever our last governor said. But I have had conversations with our new governor, and we're trying to very positively refocus the entire state government effort as well long-term, as well as rebuild a private sector effort that should also get New York on the page. So this is great work. I enjoyed this program and put us down as an active state. Thank you.
Excellent. Jeff, if you wouldn't mind putting your email in the chat.
Sure, I'll do that.
Well,
and by the way,
it
was a pleasure connecting and learning from Angela a few days ago this week.
Excellent. And, you know, folks like Howard did a lot of census related work when he was at Asian American Federation prior. And I saw other New York City partners on the call. So that's encouraging to hear. And yeah, I mean, this is, yeah, we lift up the example of Minnesota holding on by the skin of their teeth. But yeah, it's that I love that as only a way you can express in New York. It's a subway car away from.
But New York, for the first time in 70 years, only lost one congressional district. Not that that's good news, but it's not as bad news as we've had since 1950.
And by the way, California very likely would have lost potentially 2 congressional seats had we not had a more robust outreach effort, right? And so this is something that every state needs to be paying attention to, especially in the context we're talking about, you know, fertility declines and population growth slowing. These numbers will make a difference as we move forward. Angela, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, I was really just tacking onto a couple of things that that you had said, and then actually what Joan had said as well. You know, one of the things that we'll really be tackling back to the political divide is that something we were just discussing this week was that, you know, especially in Texas, leadership is going to change. The economics is going to change. Things are always going to change. And so we need to figure out a way, like one of our plans is transcending that political divide with the census and the ACS data. And that means, you know, building this, you know, continuous organization that's sort of always there as a resource. But I think it's always a resource for multi-sector. So, you know, everybody will, you know, one of our things that we talk about is we will I mean, for starters, Texas is going to overtake everybody in their population, but I'm just kidding. But we want to create, we are growing, and we want to create a thriving community that people will want to live in. We're growing a lot. We're not necessarily supporting it with our resources to support the growth and to have a good quality of life. So we need to be able to be a hub for all the different sectors to make sure that they understand how census data and the ACS is contributing to their communities and increasing, quality of life and making more people want to live in Texas. So.
Absolutely. Well, by the way, folks, as we talk, we've been focusing on some of these kind of major things about the census and what it revealed. But again, I'll just remind again about the ACS 1 year miss. The ACS is kind of like the air you breathe. You don't realize how important it is until you have air pollution, for example, right? And that's what I would say is, Joan, you've been sounding the alarm for a while. The Census Project has been sounding the alarm for a while. The ACS is not part of the permanent budget. The accuracy of the ACS has been declining over time, especially in particular communities and in particular regions within any state. Any state has a rural population, has an exurban population, and even in the core of these cities. That's one thing I found very powerful what Vida said is the kinds of people that ACDC reaches are the ones that have traditionally been less likely to vote or less likely to be reached out to. So that's a powerful way that many organizations can not only understand how the ACS is so vital to them, but make sure that they're reaching out to communities that traditionally have been undercounted, have been discounted. Joan.
I am very glad you brought up rural. That is my clarion call to all folks. I think that if we can lift up the issues for rural areas in particular, that we can get support at the policy level and the funding level. Just it's a real shame. Folks who study rural areas can't do a basic crosstab. They can't even get a total population that seems reasonable to them because of the margins of error. I think most of the work is done for larger communities and places, but if we could start to get some materials together that demonstrate how much at risk rural areas are, I think that would be something that Texas could use, that Florida could use. I think there's a lot of part of the flyover part of the country here in the Midwest that could really have advantage to that. And I should have said Census Project a week or two ago put out a white paper. You'll find it on their website about the dangers and problems for the ACS coming forward. They commissioned a study that was just released. And I think it's a powerful document that all of us can use to talk about and focus our efforts. So thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Joan, you'd put in the chat, if there are ways to better kind of build this community of practice at the state level. Let's see, Chris Wagaman from California has been, Census Legacies advisory member, long-term engaged in work. And thank you for dropping your contact info there, Chris. I am, both inspired and kind of nervous about if California doesn't get its act together the way that, Minnesota did and other states are starting to do. So I'm hopeful, at the very least, that state demographers' offices and other state agencies. I think, Joan, that's one way to make sure that it's multi-sector. Not to say that it emanates from government, but government agencies are tasked with making sure that they're engaging as many diverse ranges of constituencies, right? That is part of their charge. So I'm hopeful that could be one strategy among several. Jeff, I would love to learn more, and maybe we can have a further session in a few months in terms of what's happening in New York, trying to build those kind of partnerships. Because what the challenge we have found with philanthropy, and often it's with philanthropy, but also in government agency and government funding and support, people pay attention to the here and now, and it's really hard to get them to think about 2030. I was speaking with someone in the state legislature, and it's not Chris, someone else, talking about 2030, and they said, we don't even know which governor we're going to have in 2030. We don't know who is going to be in these various community and committees in the legislature. But folks, there are government agencies that do transportation planning, housing planning, so many other things that they think in 5, 10, 20, sometimes even 30-year cycles. So I think that's going to be an important part of the work to get people to understand that, and this is where the American Community Survey comes in. I am convinced, even as we try to tell people, think 5, 10 years down the road, it is in human nature not to think that far ahead. So the ACS has to be the way in which we get people to understand that this is vital information. What you get from third-party vendors comes from the ACS. You might not know it, you need to know it. You need to be aware of it, and you need to fight to defend it, and ideally to resource it, because it is so essential to everything we do. I don't know if there's anything anyone else wants to say before we close today. Tony, maybe I'll just say, it was really inspiring to see the game plan that you have going on for the ACS. I love it. And I'm wondering, once you get that game plan going, let's not wait an entire year to do the case study. Like let's do this kind of learning, maybe not in real time, but in a few months' time, so that we can share those insights with the field.
Thank you, Karthik. And I think that you're right. We need to be monitoring how we're progressing on this so that we can implement whatever our learnings are. I love the idea of connecting with the other states. I've already gone to school on Joan a few different times, and happy to connect with Angela on all these. But as I mentioned, we're going to be taking this to other TaxWatch type organizations across the country. And nobody needs to start from zero. We should bring everybody in at the same time. I'd love to take somebody from New York as well, one of their congressional districts, but I'd like to do it because we have everybody counted, and that's how the numbers work out, not because somebody is starting in a hole. So,
yeah, absolutely. And by the way, we've talked a lot about the business community here today, and in certain states that might be the winning strategy. In other states, it'll be other strategies. But of course, it's not a community of color versus business strategy, because you have so many communities of color that are small business owners to large business owners. You also have anyone who has to cater to our communities. If we talk about communities being underserved, it is not only being underserved by government programs, it is being underserved by corporations as well. And data and accurate data are so essential to that work.
Sue, Karthik, connect. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Sue.
Okay, no worries. Tony, just wait a second. Let's get Sue, Susan, and then we'll end with Tony and we'll close.
Okay, just the last thought. Vita was talking about the pandemic, and it really caused her and every single one of my COTRA conveners in 25 states to pivot from their more or less face-to-face canvassing and work on the civic engagement to basically becoming digital. And I think it is essential for everyone to know that ACDC and many of my other COTRA conveners were basically a civic engagement organization, a civic engagement powerhouse, but a civic engagement organization. Because of the anti-Asian hate, because of the pandemic, and they were afraid to go out, because of the stimulus bills that the administration came up with, I would have to say that the organization was essential as the communication between city, county, and state agency funding to distribute the funds from these stimulus bills. If the organization was not known to have access with 50 languages and 30 different ethnic groups, they would not have been able to help the community. And it would have been a community that just would have been suffering in silence. So I want to say, for those of you who may not connect all the dots, the demographic profiles that's been funded by COTRA Foundation since 2010, they're all ACS data. Without ACS data, we would not have demographic profiles. And a lot of my organizations are working on them now, changing them from hard copy to digital format, but they're all ACS data. So each and every one of you who've used the COTRA and Advancing Justice LA demographic profiles, we could not have made that happen without the ACS. So I just wanted to connect everything. Thanks,
Thank you so much, Sue. Sue, thank you, Sue. And yeah, Vita, we would love to be part of that learning with you as well, and to inspire others in the field, especially in AAPI and NHPI communities. By the way, I just love the ACDC acronym. I love acronyms. That ACDC acronym, of course, is just amazing. But
we tell them that we walk and, but whether we, we walk it all the time, right? But I have to agree that without data, we would not be where we are today. And it really is something that I talked to Sue about, and I get what she's trying to do with the culture of conveners and how to help us build power. But what we did during the whole pandemic, what we did with the ACS data is we were able to build trust. And that's really hard in Nevada because we're such a melting pot. To build trust and to know that we are there for them and to give them hope, that was really important. So I can't get over how important data is. I mean, when we talked about the census, we talked about, do you know, when I talk to my community, that's money coming to us. That's 1,250 coming to us. That's 12,000 in 10 years per person. So without giving them the reason why they should do it or what's in it for them, I think during the pandemic and what we've done in service, not only the food, but also the vaccine and so forth, we actually help educate and build trust.
thank you, Vito. Susan?
This is very quick, but one point I also wanted to make is that the number of community foundations in most areas outnumber private foundations. And when you look at community foundation boards, they're disproportionately represented by business leaders. And so, another sort of axis and catalyst for communication that we're hoping comes from Tony's work is to innovate, energize, mobilize more funders in Florida, not only from the nonprofit executives and administrators, but from their boards, because ultimately the boards really drive their engagement.
Thank you, Susan. Tony, I think you're going to say something in book.
Actually, it's a perfect moment because it follows up on what Susan was talking about in terms of multi-sector approach. Somebody made the comment, that there's no state organization that has all sectors represented. I actually don't think that that's a problem as long as you have a representative from each of the sectors. I love what Coulter is doing here in Florida. Thank you so much of aligning us with the Florida Philanthropic Network. We're also working with the Florida Nonprofit Alliance. The reason that the separation, the distinction is important is because we speak differently to different audiences. And sometimes the unified entity, if it's not careful, will try to market the wrong message to the wrong entity. So I think that we've got a winning strategy here, and I'm looking forward to not only working across states, but deep in Florida. So thanks.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're going to make the slides available as a PDF on our website, censuslegacies.org. There's a lot of work that's proceeding in various communities, and we are excited to be on this learning journey with you. Joan and I have been talking recently about how we can be more effective and efficient in terms of the kind of technical assistance through Census Legacies and Max that we can offer. But we're on this journey. Happy to support you all along the way. Thank you so much for taking the time, and you're the hardcore. Like, you stayed on after the 60 minutes when a bunch of people dropped off, and there's so many of us here. There are a lot of folks who signed up who were not able to make it, that we'll be sharing this recording and resources with them as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the week.
Thank you, Karthick.
Thanks, everyone. Stay well. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks,
Bye.
Coulter conveners.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Fahina.
Hi, Sue. Hi, Susie. Thank
Hi,
you.
Elaine.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.